Every Nigerian must be instrumental to the growth and development of our nation through the use of innovative energy and idea to lead and initiate policies that will sustain the economy and enhance good governance. With all the financial turmoil facing the world, it has become pertinent for exchange of new ideas that will enhance good governance. Please subscribe to our channels, listen to our messages and engage with us. With your support, we can transform the lives of all Nigerians. Welcome to the Season 2 of the NESG Radio.
Okay, so today we will be discussing the importance of trade to Nigeria's business environment. And I'm pleased to have in the studio with me a trade and competition lawyer with over 16 years of active engagement in Nigeria and the African continent. My guest in the studio obtained his Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and holds a Master of Laws in Competition Law and a postgraduate diploma in International Business Law, both from the University of London, and a master's degree in International Affairs and Strategic Studies, and has researched extensively on the World Trade Organization and the role of power politics in international trade relations. Mr. Leonard Ugbajah is the founder and executive director of the Center for Trade and Business Environment Advocacy, CTBA, as well as the principal consultant at TBE Advisory Limited. He leads the NASSBER Trade thematic area and provides technical support to the National Assembly. You're welcome to the studio, Mr. Leonard Ugbajah.
Thank you, Nsikan. It's my pleasure to join you.
Okay, thank you for coming. So I'll just kickstart. We often hear about trade barriers and how they negatively impact, developing countries. While some may argue that these trade barriers, provide short-term benefits to certain sectors or industries, there are a few who believe that in the long term, it's negative consequences for the overall economic growth and competitiveness of our economy. So could you just tell us a bit about some of these barriers?
Thank you. So looking at trade barriers, they are generally of two kinds. The first one is the tariffs, and we're talking now in the context of import and export trade, that's trading with other countries. So there are tariffs, and that means every country would fix tariffs for the goods that are coming into their country, and what we popularly call import duties. And of course, like you said, there are advantages to fixing import duties and charging import duties on imports, because apart from the obvious fact that it raises revenue for the government, it's also a way of protecting strategic sectors of your domestic industry. So, for example, if you want to grow a particular industry, you could levy high import duties on the products in that industry. Say, for example, motor vehicles. If you want to grow domestic capacity to produce motor vehicles, you could raise your import duties on motor vehicles, just to give your local industries that breathing space to be able to compete, especially when imported ones are coming from countries with better facilities and better infrastructure and low cost of production. So yes, some domestic players benefit, and also some domestic players will lose. It's a bit complex because if the high import duty, and I'm using just the tariff barriers now, we'll come to the non-tariff barriers later. Now, if the high import duty affects goods that are required by some domestic industries to produce, for example, intermediate goods, maybe machinery, maybe some raw materials. What you realize is that those industries domestically that require those raw materials to produce will be at a disadvantage, because it would then increase their cost of production because of the high costs of the raw materials or intermediate goods they need. Now, in terms of non-tariff barriers, they can take different form. So, for example, regulations relating to rules of origin, those are non-tariff barriers, and maybe I'll talk about that later in the context of the AFCFTA. There are also regulations relating to prohibitions. So, for example, we have the CBN list of items not eligible for forex. So, you have two options. You could move these the items on this list and put them on a high tariff band. So for example, put them 40-50% tariff. But you could also just ban outrightly. Now there's the issue of import prohibition being inconsistent with WTO rules. Generally speaking, they are very, very, very fine exceptions, but generally the way we use the import prohibitions in Nigeria run against WTO rules, generally speaking. Now, so tariff barriers are basically impediments to the free flow of goods, especially when you're trading across border. So it could be, like I said, tariffs, it could be non-tariffs, it could also even be standards, quality standards. Yes, that a country imposes, legitimately for the protection of health, safety of persons, of animals, of plants, that's sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Or it could not just be the technical regulations relating to packaging, relating to labeling, relating to the process through which you produce an item, or relating to environmental sustainability to say that, you must meet this environmental sustainability standards and all that. So these are all different barriers. Some trade barriers are legitimate. They serve legitimate public purpose. Others are more protectionist than legitimate, in the sense that countries use them strategically to protect their domestic industries, against foreign competition. So trade barriers exist, and they are regulated, for example, under the WTO, they are regulated under the AFCFTA, and even in ECOWAS. And in fact, something as common as police checkpoints on the highways could be a trade barrier.
Wow.
For example, when you're trucking from Benin Republic to, say, Abuja, the illegal stops, mostly illegal stops you encounter on the way, on the highway, are also trade barriers on their own. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I'm happy to hear this, because, there's always a tendency to think that it's all in the negative, but these barriers are actually sometimes there to protect some key sectors of the economy. So which brings me to my next question. These trade barriers, how do they impact Nigeria's business environment? Looking at it holistically, what role do they play in impacting business environment? And then I would also use the opportunity to ask how we can then have, would you say Nigeria has efficient legal frameworks for trade at the moment?
Okay, so if you look at trade in terms of buying and selling, trade is a source of livelihood for a good number of the population. Historical data of the NBS shows that trade has been a major contributor to Nigeria's GDP. Wholesale and retail trade has been a major contributor to Nigeria's GDP over the years, but then you can't trade effectively where you have what I'll call irritants, in a business environment. So you ask for examples. So we'll just go back to the role that the public institutions play, and the role in terms of regulation and implementation of regulation, and the roles that the public institutions play also in terms of providing the enabling infrastructure. So if I did a study, I think think about 2 or 3 years ago, looking at logistics and supply chain in Nigeria. And in that, an amazing finding was that it was more expensive to truck your goods from Lagos to Kano, than for you to ship the same goods from China to Lagos. So
wow.
You see, yes, because the cost of trucking domestically is affected by poor infrastructure. So you see the trucks breaking down on the road, poor regulation of trucking services. So you see very rickety trucks on the road, upturning, spilling the content and all that, and this is something that to a large extent an effective rail infrastructure system would be able to solve. That then where you're not battling with the road or with the rickety trucks, you're battling with the security agencies that are mounted along the road, or even with the tax collectors along the road, the local government, state, some say it's emblem, some say produce tax, all manner of levies and taxes, even though where it is clear in Nigeria that it's illegal for people to mount the road, to collect taxes. But it's still a common practice all over the country. So these are some of the irritants that affect, the transaction cost of trading domestically. Now I'm talking about trading within Nigeria at the moment. And the idea is that for you to grow an efficient economy with an efficient supply chain, because that's necessary for other parts of the economy to grow. So for the manufacturer needs to source their raw material. So maybe the manufacturer is in Ogun State and the source of raw material is in Adamawa, and also the manufacturer needs to sell their goods. Now, how do they source the raw materials? It's the process of trade. So you have to buy from somewhere, you have to carry the raw material somehow to your point of production. And after production, you also need to sell your goods and make sure your goods go as far as possible, to be sold. But where the infrastructure is bad, where the regulatory framework is bad in terms of what these multiple levies and taxes, or where the government agencies who are supposed to superintend over these things are not doing their work effectively. Businesses are stifled. So if you use any kind of economic model, you'll be able to attach a cost to these inefficiencies in the supply chain, and the cost goes to businesses, and businesses transfer to domestic consumers when they are able to, because not
Absolutely.
all the time. Yeah. Then when they are not able to, then that's when you hear businesses begin to fold up, or like we say, some of them basically, especially multinationals, where the domestic environment becomes unbearable for them, they fold up and relocate to a neighboring country and they produce and then still sell to you. But what you have lost in this process, you've lost jobs, you've lost technical know-how that should have been transferred to your locals and all that. So for any serious country, you need to address the barriers to trade internally. Those same barriers to trade internally eventually have a negative impact on your capacity to export. Because then, in the days we were negotiating the EU ECOWAS Economic Partnership Agreement around 2007, 8, 9, 10, one of the studies we had then showed that it was 30% more expensive to produce in Nigeria than in our neighboring countries in West Africa. The cost of production, that just by the fact that you're producing in Nigeria, your cost is already 30% higher, because of inefficiencies in the business environment. So you see, this is a disincentive to investment. If an investor is thinking of coming to invest in Africa, for example, in the context of the AFCFTA to take advantage of the broader African market, the investor will look for countries that have the least friction, in trading, in the movement of goods and services. So that's the way it impacts the business environment and the economy as a whole.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leonard. In fact, I've learned a lot from this, particularly the ripple effect of, just having several stops at on the road and what it entails for a business owner, how that increases the cost of food items, of our goods and services. You said something which for me I would like for you to speak more on. You had mentioned that for us to address the barriers to trade, we have to first of all look inwardly as a nation. And so I would like to know, do we have as a country, do we have a coordinated trade public institution, that would basically do some form of evaluation around the issues of trade barriers to come up with some relevant policies and then take action, implement, and then have some legislative framework around that?
Okay, so we've never really been in want of policies or recommendations or committees, or we've never really been in want of that. Let's go to the issue of logistics, transportation within Nigeria, trucking goods within Nigeria. So it's something that is within the purview of the states, local governments, and the federal government. So, for example, you have the Joint Tax Board, which has or is trying to streamline the collection of taxes, across the country. But the effect is still. The impact is still minimal, at least from a layman's perspective, looking at what we still see on the roads. We have the taxes, the approved taxes and levies. I'm trying to remember the exact title of that law, which has tried...
The harmonized taxes and levies?
Yes, which has tried to harmonize the kind of taxes and levies, that could be charged, and even how they could be paid, and all that. But you realize that, number one, the list there is still long, quite long. That's the taxes that states, local governments, and federal government could charge, just to get a harmonized list. Now, the list is still excessively long, number one. Number two, states introduce or local governments introduce new levies and taxes without recourse to that law. So it's still problematic. And the law outlawed the use of touts, on the roads to collect taxes. But that still happens, So we have the laws, we have the institutions, but probably what we need is the decisive political will to be able to address these issues. In terms of other kind of barriers, especially those dealing with external trade, import and export. Recently the Customs and Excise Management Act has been amended, to address some of the issues relating to electronics filing, use of electronic declarations, pre-arrival risk assessment, and other kind of modern tools, custom tools, to facilitate the clearance of goods and services. Now, but except the custom migrates fully to a single window system, with functional scanners, we still have the frictions, at the ports. Now, we know about the custom modernization project, which is about 3.2 billion, and the controversies surrounding it at the moment. Now, some countries around us, Togo, and Kenya, and all that, they've migrated to single window interface, with functional scanners for long. We should have a target of 24 hours, cargo dwell time at the port. That means you must be able to clear your cargo within 24 hours at the port, But Nigeria is still very far from that from that vision. Now, so yes, what I'm driving at is this: that in terms of legal reforms, we've done quite a few. You also recall about the exploits of PEBEC in the immediate past administration, the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, that sought to address these frictions, in ease of doing business, both at those relating to the federal government and even at the subnational level. For the short period I was at PEBEC, I was leading the work on subnational ease of doing business. So basically, trying to get the states, to imbibe best practices, and holding them towards implementing these reforms. So it's not for want of policies, it's not for want of laws, it's not for want of initiatives. Probably the missing link there is the political will to follow through with reforms, and make sure that those who work against the reforms, receive their just desert. That's what we call consequence management. So, for example, if targets are set for MDAs, if target is set for the police, if target is set for the customs, and they are not able to meet those targets, then somebody should answer to it. And when heads of government agencies know that they could lose their jobs for failing to meet up with their targets on facilitating trade, whether it is domestic trade or whether it is import and export trade, when heads of government agencies know that they can lose their job for dropping the ball, then they will make sure that those under them, do the right things. So that getting the consequence management right, I think, is still the missing link. So, for example, the head of an agency could come to the meeting, agree on targets, and then go home, without effectively monitoring to ensure that his or her staff abide by that. And you can't do anything because that head of government agency probably, has a godfather in Aso Rock or something, and so we just come and keep talking about the same things over and over again. And then things that should be simple look like rocket science. So consequence management is the missing link.
Very much, Mr. Ugbajah. That's really insightful. And I agree with you that, the political will to actually follow through with the reforms is basically what will take trade, forward in the coming years. Let's look at the AFCTA. Basically, I know Nigeria has ratified the AFCTA agreement, which demonstrates a commitment to our participation in the trade agreement and, the promotion of regional integration. I'll just like to know, are there legislative imperatives from that agreement, and what are they?
Oh, yes, they are. So the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is supposed to be, it's a free trade agreement. So that means the countries or the state parties, as they are technically called, to the AFCFTA, have agreed to liberalize trade among themselves gradually, with very tiny limits, set, what we call the excluded tariff product. Now, so it means that every country will have to go back and then look at their regulations, look at their laws. If, for example, you're having so Nigeria, in terms of tariffs, or what we call import duties, Nigeria used the ECOWAS Common External Tariff. It has, I think, 5 bands starting from 0, 5%, 10%, 15, 20, 10, 20, and 35, which is the highest band, with some exceptions, import adjustment and all that. So now it means we have to come back to our tariff book, and align our tariff. If you have an import duty of 30% on a product, and for some reason you have agreed to liberalize that product in the context of the AFCFTA, that means you have to change your tariff book to reflect that for products coming from state parties to the AFCFTA, this is the tariff that is going to apply. based on the tariff schedule you've submitted as part of your negotiation. So that's a kind of legislative or policy change that would occur. But on a more concrete basis, there are certain legislative reforms you need to implement a trade agreement. So, for example, you need to first of all domesticate that agreement, and by that I mean you need to make that agreement applicable or justiciable in your local courts. Now, it's a bit technical, but follow it this way. So when you go to Kigali to sign an agreement, as was done in 2018 for the AFCFTA, although Nigeria signed subsequently in Niamey. Now, and you issue your instrument of ratification. That's the instrument that says, we sent Mr. A to go and negotiate this agreement. So he signed on our behalf that saying, so we like the outcome of the agreement. Then Mr. A comes back, submits his report to the Federal Executive Council, and then praise the Federal Executive Council to ratify what he has done on our behalf. So that's ratification. So the Federal Executive Council ratifies what he has done on our behalf. Mr. A takes that instrument of ratification, goes back to the state parties and say, my home government has agreed with this. That's ratification. And at the point of ratification, you're bound by the rules in that agreement. It's a common international law principle called Pax sunt servanda, which means parties are bound by their agreement. And at that point where you become bound, you cannot go back to the parties and say, I cannot implement provision XYZ because my domestic law does not allow me to implement it. No. What the trade agreement requires, and it's usually expressly stated, and it's also expressly stated whether it is in the case of the AFCFTA or any other trade agreement, that state parties are expected to go back and bring their legal provisions, their domestic laws and regulations in compliance with the agreement they've entered. So you enter into an agreement, your obligation is then to go and look at your local laws, your regulations, your policies, and anyone that is at variance with what you have signed. Your obligation is to amend them, not to use them as an excuse to evade your obligation. So now, in the case of the AFCFTA, apart from the fact that our tariff book will need to be tinkered with, and that has already been done because Nigeria has submitted a goods schedule, liberalization schedule, together with the ECOWAS. Now, you also have to look at, in the area of trade and services, for example, if you have made a commitment on, say, professional services, or say in telecommunications or in financial services, you have made commitments there. Now, if there are regulations domestically that run contrary to your obligation, you have to change them. Now, in your domestic pattern of determining rules of origin, you have to also bring that into alignment with the rules of origin in the FTA that you have signed. So there's a whole lot. In the case of Nigeria, there are certain legal institutional infrastructure that we are lacking. So for you to implement a free trade agreement, for example, you need to have what you call trade defense mechanism. What does this mean? Now, and not just peculiar to the AFCFTA. This we should have had. It's actually a WTO requirement, and Nigeria has been part of the WTO from inception in 1995. But we don't have this trade defense mechanism. Now, what does that mean? It means that there are certain mechanisms allowed in free trade agreements to protect your domestic industries, and these are three. You have the safeguard measures, you have the anti-dumping measures. For safeguard measures, so for example, in the context of the AFCFTA, there's an import surge, an unexpected import surge that threatens the local industries. You can then use the safeguard measures to reduce that import, and this oversimplification. Now, but before you can do that, the rules require that you have an institution that will collect the data, conduct the proper investigation, before those rules can apply. Now, you cannot just wake up and say, I ban the importation of this, and that's what Nigeria is doing. And that's why I say that our trade policy measures are mostly inconsistent with our obligations at WTO, at the ECOWAS, and probably would continue like that under the AFCFTA. Now, it also applies to anti-dumping measures. So, for example, if particular goods are coming into your country, at a below market value, because the country where they are being produced have this strategic objective to flood your market with those goods and, send your domestic industries packing as a long-term strategy. You can use anti-dumping measures. You can also use anti-subsidy measures where the goods coming into your country are subsidized in the country where they are coming from. Now, but for you to use these measures, you have to enact a law and establish an institution, called a trade defense authority or trade remedies authority, and equip that institution with the right human resource, to be able to do the investigation, do the technical calculation, and be able to apply the rules. Without that, the rules of international trade will not allow you to use these tools of trade remedies. So that's one reform that Nigeria needs to do like yesterday. So there are a whole lot of other legal reforms that are necessary.
I'm happy to know that there's a lot in the space, particularly even at subnational level, and I believe as we go on with time, a lot of states would be brought to speed with what they need to do. You've mentioned a lot of buzzwords for me in trade, and I think trade has a lot of words that just keeps bringing up. One of them, I think I learned at the World Economic Forum, is the word friendshoring. And I would just like for you to speak a little bit about it, because it was new to me, and the context in which it was used, and how it plays out and its impact on Africa was something that I was really interested in. So I'll be grateful if you could just, take a minute or two to speak about that, sir.
Okay. So, you cannot separate trade from geopolitics. Now, and we've had an era of heightened geopolitics during the Cold War. But now we are also having another era of heightened geopolitics. So whether it is the US versus China, US versus the Western world versus Russia, and all that. So these are all geopolitics. And the way trade or global value chains are structured, especially post-Cold War, and the emergence of China as a major player, economic player in international arena, is that countries or companies, rather, not even countries, companies locate their production facilities in countries where they think they can get the best value. So in terms of reduced cost of production. So maybe because there's a lot of skilled human resource available, or maybe there's raw material available, or there are just efficient logistics available for them to produce there. So like most of the big US corporations, the techs, the Apples, and the rest of them, they've for long maintained their production, their factories in China, for example. China has been the biggest beneficiary of what you call offshoring. Now, so offshoring is basically what I've tried to explain. So you locate your production facilities in regions or countries, where you think you get the best value, and then you can, import those goods into your own country and all that. So that's the way world global value chains have been organized over time. Now, when geopolitical tensions become high, and countries are competing for space in the international system, you're looking at how do you use your economic leverage to weaken the power of the other of your competitors. So, for example, the US under Trump became very aggressive, about towards China, and that policy has continued. what those countries begin to do is to encourage their companies using a variety of policy and even subtle coercion to encourage their home countries to locate their factories, in friendly countries. So you're moving from offshoring. Offshoring is producing outside of your home country to friendshoring. Friendshoring is, I'm not just going to produce outside my country, but I'm going to produce in a country that I have a long-standing friendship, alliance, ideological affinity with. So you see the US using in some industrial policy measures to, in fact, the related concept is reshoring. So the US is using a lot of industrial policy measures to reshore. That's to bring back those manufacturing facilities outside back into the US. That's one part of it. Friendshoring is to take them to more friendly countries. So one of the biggest beneficiaries of friendshoring now are countries like India, Vietnam. Yes, so these are some of the, even Ethiopia to some extent, are some of the places where these factories live in China, because of geopolitical tension. These are the places they are going to. Now, for Africa, and I like you talking about the context and implications of Africa. And this also ties into our conversation about the business environment now. So if you're a friend, say of the European Union, of the US, so that means you can be a beneficiary of friendshoring. But if your investment climate is not conducive enough, then no company wants to invest. So if you're placed on a scale, say there's a possibility of US companies, reshoring or friendshoring to Africa, and they count, options 10 countries in Africa. They'll first of all go and look for the investment climate performance of those countries. They'll look at the countries that have, the best performance in export and import trade, because that's critical. They'll have to bring in raw materials, they'll have to export their finished products. They'll have to bring in intermediate materials, they'll have to export. Now, they'll look at the countries that perform best in export and import trade, ease of cross-border trade. They look at your tax regime. They look at your the ease of accessing funding. They look at your regulations. They look at, so these are the major indicators. They look at the availability of skilled manpower. So that's what your education system producing, and these are all considerations that inform your investment climate performance. Now, if out of 10, because it's a competition, if out of 10 countries that are possible destinations of that investment in Africa, your country is number 10, then you're sure you're not going to get those investments. That's the way it works. So friendshoring is a huge advantage, to countries that are investment ready. For countries that are not investment ready, friendshoring, you just see it, you just watch it on TV, how the investments are passing you by, and going to other countries. So I recall in the past few days when we were involved in the work for the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act, how Nigeria lost huge investments in that industry. Where did those investments go to? They went to Ghana, they went to even Uganda, to Mozambique, to Angola, African countries that were even discovering petroleum, crude oil and gas, newly received a lot of funding that could have come to Nigeria. Why? Because the regulatory environment was uncertain for a very long time. So you could benefit from the shifting dynamics of global value chain, but if your domestic environment is not conducive, investment will go elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leonard, for this, insightful interview. Just some last words from you on the NASSBER trade thematic area.
Yeah, so, talking about all the efforts, and I said we've never been in want of efforts, and what NASG has done through NASSBER is one of the commendable efforts towards improving the business environment in Nigeria, especially improving the quality of legislation, to make sure that legislation really represents the current reality and represents the aspirations of all the stakeholders. So it's been my pleasure, particularly working with NASSBER and leading the trade thematic group. I can recount the number of bills that NASSBER has, worked on, improved their quality, even including the PIA that I just mentioned, the Petroleum Industry Act, the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act, the Corporate Affairs, the Companies and Allied Matters Act, a whole lot of them, and even the recent Investment and Securities Bill, and all that. So it's been an impactful work that NASSBER has been doing, and I hope it continues. And I hope it continues so that we can continue to contribute to the quality of legislation, in Nigeria through stakeholders engagement and expert analysis.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ugbajah. It's been really insightful, and I have learned a lot just listening to you. For those who don't know what NASSBER is the National Assembly Business Environment Roundtable here at the NASG. So thank you once again for being a part of today's interview. Wish you all the best in your endeavors.
Thank you for being a part of today's interesting program. You can learn more about the NASG's If Not Now When campaign at www.ifnotnowwhen.ng. You can also listen to other interesting conversations by visiting www.nasggroup.org/podcasts.